When Lillian Foster inherited her late husband's sprawling ranch in northern Wyoming, she thought she knew every acre, every fence line, every building on the property. She'd lived there for 23 years after all. But 3 months after burying Henry, while sorting through decades of financial records in his cluttered office, she found a hand-drawn map tucked inside a 1987 ledger. The map showed a structure she'd never seen before, a corral marked with coordinates that didn't match anything she recognized, and scrawled in Henry's unmistakable handwriting were 3 words that made her blood run cold. Promise kept, alone. Now, before I tell you what Lillian found when she finally located that hidden corral, I need to ask you something. Have you ever discovered that someone you loved, someone you thought you knew completely, had been keeping a secret so profound it changed everything you believed about them? Not a betrayal, but something else. Something that revealed a depth of character you never imagined. Drop a comment below with your city and tell me, would you want to know? And if this story intrigues you even a fraction as much as it did me when I first heard it, hit that like button and subscribe, because what Lillian discovered didn't just change her understanding of her husband, it changed her entire life. Now let me take you back to where this really began. Lillian had always considered herself a practical woman. At 51, she'd spent most of her adult life on the Double H Ranch, named for Henry and his father Harold, learning to mend fences, manage cattle rotations, and navigate the brutal Wyoming winters that could kill a herd if you weren't vigilant. She wasn't the sentimental type. When Henry died suddenly of a heart attack while checking the north pasture, she'd cried exactly once, at the funeral, and then rolled up her sleeves and got back to work. The ranch didn't run itself, and grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. The Double H sprawled across 3,200 acres of wind-scraped prairie and pine-studded hills. Henry had inherited it from his father 30 years ago, back when cattle prices were good, and a man could still make an honest living from the land. Over the decades, they'd modernized what they could, upgrading the irrigation system, adding solar panels to the main barn, replacing rotted fencing with steel. But the ranch retained the bones of its 100-year history. There were old line shacks scattered across the property, some dating back to the 1920s, and sections of original barbed wire that had gone rusty and slack with age. Lillian knew the ranch the way you know your own reflection, or so she'd thought. Henry had always handled the paperwork, the tax records, the grazing permits, the endless bureaucracy that came with managing a working ranch. Lillian focused on the physical labor, the day-to-day operations that kept everything running. It was an arrangement that had worked for over 2 decades. But now, with Henry gone, she had no choice but to wade through the filing cabinets and cardboard boxes that filled his small office off the main house. The office was a disaster. Henry had never been organized, preferring to stuff papers into whatever folder or drawer was closest. Lillian spent weeks sorting through everything, creating piles for the accountant, for the lawyer, for the shred bin. She found ancient vaccination records for cattle long since sold, receipts for equipment purchased before she'd even met Henry, and love letters she'd written to him during their brief courtship that made her throat tighten. And then, on a grey afternoon in late September, she found the map. It was folded inside a leather-bound ledger from 1987, the year before they'd married. The map itself was drawn on yellowed graph paper, the kind Henry used to sketch out pasture rotations. But this wasn't a pasture map. The landmarks were familiar: Red Creek, the twin boulders near the eastern boundary, the old logging road that hadn't been used in 40 years. But they oriented around a structure Lillian had never seen. A corral drawn as a perfect square, with a small rectangle beside it that might have been a shelter or a shed. Coordinates were written in the margin, latitude and longitude, precise to 6 decimal places. Below them, in Henry's cramped handwriting, promise kept, alone. Lillian stared at the map for a long time, turning it over in her hands, looking for context that wasn't there. The ledger itself offered no clues, just columns of numbers recording feed purchases and veterinary expenses from nearly 40 years ago. She tried to remember 1987, what had been happening in Henry's life before they'd met. He'd never talked much about those years. She knew his father had still been alive then, still running the ranch with an iron fist. Henry had been in his late 20s, working the land, but not yet in charge of it. A promise kept. But what promise? And to whom? Alone. That word bothered her most. It suggested isolation, secrecy, something Henry had maintained by himself, without help, without witnesses. Lillian made coffee and sat at Henry's desk, studying the map under the bright LED lamp. The location, if she was reading the landmarks correctly, was in the far northeastern section of the ranch, a wild, heavily forested area that bordered federal land. It was rough country, accessible only by an old jeep trail that had probably washed out years ago. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been out there, maybe never. There was no reason to go, no water sources for cattle, no viable grazing, just steep hills and dense stands of lodgepole pine. But Henry had gone there, recently enough to maintain whatever was out there. The map was old, but the words looked fresher, written in a different pen, perhaps added years after the original drawing. Lillian made a decision. Tomorrow, she'd find it. She'd take the ATV as far as the terrain allowed, then hike the rest if necessary. She needed to know what her husband had been protecting all these years. She needed to understand what alone meant. Lillian set out at dawn, when the September air still carried the bite of the coming winter. She'd loaded the ATV with supplies, water, first aid kit, rope, wire cutters, her father's old Colt revolver that she kept for coyotes, and the occasional mountain lion. The GPS unit mounted to the handlebars showed the coordinates from Henry's map as a blinking red dot, still 4.3 miles away. The jeep trail was worse than she'd expected. What had once been a navigable road had degraded into a series of erosion gullies and fallen timber. Twice she had to stop and clear branches, her breath coming hard in the thin mountain air. The ATV's engine whined in protest as she forced it up steep inclines, the knobby tires fighting for purchase on loose scree. After an hour, she reached the end of what could generously be called a trail. The GPS showed another 1.5 miles to go, almost due north, through forest so thick the morning sun barely penetrated. Lillian killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the silence. This far from the ranch house, there were no sounds of civilization, no distant truck engines, no cattle, no power lines humming overhead, just wind in the pines and the occasional call of a raven. She secured the ATV and started walking, following the GPS bearing. The forest floor was a carpet of pine needles and rotting logs, treacherous with hidden holes and loose stones. Lillian moved carefully, testing each step. At her age, a twisted ankle out here could be fatal. Her phone had no signal. It rarely did this far into the backcountry, so if something went wrong, she was on her own. The thought didn't frighten her as much as it should have. Maybe that was the grief talking, the part of her that didn't much care anymore what happened. Or maybe it was something else, a growing curiosity that bordered on obsession. What had Henry hidden out here, and why? After 40 minutes of hiking, the forest began to change. The trees grew larger, older, their trunks thick with moss and their branches forming a cathedral ceiling overhead. The underbrush thinned, making walking easier, but somehow more unsettling. This was old-growth forest, the kind that existed before logging companies had clear-cut most of Wyoming. These trees had been here for centuries. The GPS showed she was close now, less than 100 yards. Lillian's heart began to pound. Though whether from exertion or anticipation, she couldn't say. She pushed through a final stand of young aspens, their golden leaves trembling in the breeze. And there it was. The corral was larger than she'd expected, maybe 60 feet square, built from logs that had weathered to a silvery gray. But what stopped Lillian in her tracks wasn't the corral itself. It was the fact that the structure was clearly maintained. The logs were solid, not rotted. The gates hung true on their hinges. Fresh gravel had been spread in one corner, and a water trough, though currently empty, showed no rust or decay. Someone had been caring for this place recently. Next to the corral stood a small, three-sided shelter, just big enough for a horse or two to escape the weather. The roof was corrugated metal, relatively new, and inside, Lillian could see hay bales stacked neatly against the back wall. She walked slowly to the corral fence, her hand trailing along the smooth wood. The gate was secured with a chain and combination lock. A combination lock, not keyed, which meant Henry hadn't wanted to risk losing access if he lost a key. He'd wanted to ensure he could always get in. But why? For what? The corral was empty. No horse, no cattle, nothing. Just well-maintained fencing and fresh gravel and that stack of hay that couldn't be more than a few months old. Except Henry had been dead for 3 months. The realization hit Lillian like a physical blow. Someone else had been here. Someone else knew about this place. She spun around, scanning the forest, suddenly aware of how alone she was, how vulnerable. But the woods remained silent, indifferent. No movement, no sounds except the wind and her own rapid breathing. Lillian pulled out her phone, still no signal, and took several photos of the corral, the shelter, everything. Evidence, though, of what she wasn't sure. Then she examined the lock more carefully. It was a 4-digit combination lock, the kind you could buy at any hardware store. She tried Henry's birthday, 0614. Nothing. Their anniversary, 0915. Nothing. His father's birthday, his mother's, every significant date she could think of. The lock remained stubbornly closed. She was about to give up when she noticed the scratches in the dirt near the gate. Not random scuffs, but distinct marks. Hoof prints, fresh hoof prints, partially obscured by wind and weather but still visible. A horse had been here, and not long ago. Lillian's mind raced. Had Henry been keeping a horse out here? But why the secrecy? They had perfectly good stables at the main ranch, and Henry loved horses. He would have been proud to show off a new animal, not hide it in the middle of nowhere. Unless it wasn't his horse, unless he was keeping it for someone else. But who? And again, why here? Why the isolation? Why the locked gate and the cryptic note about a promise kept? Lillian walked the perimeter of the corral looking for any other clues. On the far side, partially hidden by the shelter, she found a metal chest secured with another combination lock. The chest was new, heavy-duty plastic designed to withstand weather. Through the translucent lid, she could see bags of grain, veterinary supplies, grooming tools, everything you'd need to care for a horse. Someone was still caring for a horse, even after Henry died. The sun had climbed higher, and Lillian realized she'd been here for over an hour. She needed to get back before dark, needed time to think, to process what she'd found. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye, a glint of metal hanging from a nail inside the shelter. She walked over and found a key, just a simple brass key on a loop of wire, hung at eye level where anyone standing under the shelter would see it immediately. The key was labeled with a single piece of tape. Emergency only. Lillian took the key down, turning it over in her palm. It wasn't for the combination locks, too small, maybe for the metal chest, but that had a combination lock too. So what did it open? She pocketed the key and took one last look around. The forest had grown darker, clouds moving in from the west. A storm was coming, the kind that could drop 6 inches of snow this time of year. She needed to leave. But as Lillian started back toward her ATV, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Not by anything human, the forest was too still for that, but by something else, something that knew she'd found the corral and was waiting to see what she'd do next. Lillian didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, turning the brass key over and over in her hands. The storm had arrived around midnight, dumping 3 inches of wet snow that wouldn't last but would make the back roads impassable for a few days. Just as well, she needed time to think. In the morning, she went back to Henry's office with new purpose. If he'd been maintaining that corral for years, there had to be other records. supply purchases, veterinary visits, something that would explain what she'd found. She started with the most recent files, working backward through the years. Henry's filing system, such as it was, grouped expenses by category rather than chronology, which made searching tedious. But Lillian was nothing if not persistent. She found the first clue in a folder labeled Misk Farm, receipts for grain purchases, 50-pound bags of senior horse feed, the kind formulated for older animals with dental issues. The purchases went back years, 1 or 2 bags every month, paid for in cash at a feed store in a town 40 miles away, not their usual supplier. Somewhere Henry could shop anonymously. Next, she found veterinary records for a horse named Apollo. No last name, no ranch identification, just Apollo, and a series of dates spanning nearly 15 years. Vaccinations, dental work, a treatment for a hoof abscess in 2019. The vet's name was Dr. Ingrid Paulson, and her practice was based in the same distant town where Henry had bought the feed. Lillian grabbed her phone and dialed the number on the vet's letterhead. It rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered. Paulson Equine Services. Yes, hello. My name is Lillian Foster. I'm calling about a horse named Apollo. I believe my late husband Henry Foster was one of your clients. A pause. Then, I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Foster. Yes, I knew Henry. Good man. How can I help you? I need to know about Apollo. I found records, but I don't know where the horse is or whose horse it is. Another pause. Longer this time. When Dr. Paulson spoke again, her voice was careful. Mrs. Foster, I think we should talk in person. Are you available tomorrow? I could drive out to you or we could meet at my office. Why can't you tell me over the phone? Because what I know about Apollo and your husband, it's complicated. And I promised Henry I'd never discuss it unless certain circumstances arose. I think those circumstances have arrived. Lillian's hand tightened on the phone. What circumstances? His death. Henry made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd make sure Apollo was taken care of. He said, if you came looking, I should tell you everything, so please, can we meet? They agreed on the following afternoon at Dr. Paulson's clinic. Lillian spent the intervening hours in a fog of confusion and frustration. Every answer seemed to spawn 10 new questions. The drive to Dr. Paulson's office took her through country she rarely visited, rolling plains giving way to the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. The clinic was a modest building attached to a small barn, surrounded by white-fenced paddocks. A sign out front read, Paulson Equine Services, Large Animal Veterinary Care. Dr. Ingrid Paulson met her at the door. She was younger than Lillian expected, maybe 40, with prematurely grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her handshake was firm, her eyes kind but guarded. Thank you for coming, Ingrid said, leading Lillian into a small office that smelled of leather and antiseptic. Can I get you coffee? Just answers, please. Ingrid nodded and sat down behind her desk, gesturing for Lillian to take the opposite chair. For a moment, she just studied Lillian's face, as if searching for something. Henry first came to me in 2010, Ingrid began. He showed up unannounced with a horse trailer and a severely malnourished gelding. The horse was maybe 20 years old, covered in scars, half blind from cataracts. Henry said he'd found the animal abandoned on federal land, starving and neglected. He wanted to know if I could save him. Lillian felt something tighten in her chest. That sounded like Henry. He'd always had a soft spot for animals in distress. I told him honestly that the horse might not make it, Ingrid continued, but Henry insisted we try. He paid for everything up front, in cash, and he made an unusual request. He asked me to keep the horse's existence completely confidential, not to register any treatments under the Double H Ranch, not to mention the horse to anyone. He said it was for the horse's protection. Protection from what? From his previous owner. Ingrid leaned forward. Henry told me the horse belonged to his brother. Lillian felt the world tilt. Henry didn't have a brother. He did, an older brother named Raymond. But according to Henry, Raymond died in 1987. And before he died, he made Henry promise something, that Henry would take care of Apollo, Raymond's beloved horse, for the rest of the animal's life. But there was a condition. The horse could never be brought to the main ranch. Never anywhere that Raymond and Henry's father might see it. Lillian's mind reeled. She'd been married to Henry for nearly 40 years, and he'd never once mentioned a brother. Not once. Why? She managed to ask. Why the secrecy? Ingrid's expression turned grave. Because Henry and Raymond's father, your husband's father, was the one who abused Apollo in the first place. He used the horse for illegal activities, beat it when it didn't perform, starved it as punishment. Raymond tried to protect the horse, tried to stand up to their father, and according to Henry, that confrontation ended with Raymond's death. The office suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. Lillian gripped the arms of her chair. How did Raymond die? Henry never gave me details. He just said it was his fault, that he should have protected his brother, and that caring for Apollo was the only way he could honor Raymond's memory. He built that corral in the remote part of the ranch, so his father would never find it. And even after his father died, that was in the early 90s, I think, Henry kept the secret. He said the horse deserved privacy, deserved to live out its days in peace without anyone knowing its history. Lillian thought of the map, the words, promise kept, alone. It was starting to make horrible sense. Is Apollo still alive? She whispered. Ingrid nodded slowly. Against all odds, yes. That horse should have died 15 years ago, but he's stubborn. Last I checked, about 2 weeks ago, he was still hanging on. But Mrs. Foster, he won't last much longer. He's pushing 40 years old. Every day is borrowed time. Who's been caring for him? Henry's been dead for 3 months. I have, Ingrid said quietly. Henry set up a fund, paid me in advance to continue feeding and checking on Apollo for up to 6 months after his death. He hoped the horse would pass naturally in that time, that you'd never have to know. But Apollo's tougher than either of us expected. Lillian stood abruptly, needing to move, to process. Take me to him. I need to see this horse. Ingrid hesitated. Are you sure? Henry specifically asked that you not be burdened with this. Henry's dead, and I'm the one who found the map, who discovered the corral. I'm already burdened. Lillian's voice cracked. Please, I need to understand. The drive back to the Double H took on a surreal quality. Ingrid followed in her truck, and Lillian led her through the maze of ranch roads and trails to where she'd left the ATV 3 days before. The snow had melted, leaving the ground muddy but passable. They transferred supplies to the ATV. Ingrid insisted on bringing fresh feed and medical equipment and made the journey to the corral together. Lillian drove while Ingrid held on behind her, and for the first time since finding the map, Lillian felt the weight of what she was about to face. A brother, Henry had a brother and never told her, had lived with that secret, carried that grief for their entire marriage. What else hadn't he shared? What other parts of his life had he kept hidden, locked away like that corral in the woods? When they reached the clearing, Lillian stopped the ATV and just stared. In daylight, with another person present, the place looked different. Less mysterious, more sad, just an old corral in the middle of nowhere, a monument to secrets and promises and pain. Ingrid climbed off the ATV and walked to the gate. From her pocket, she pulled out a slip of paper and worked the combination lock. It opened with a soft click. Henry gave me the combination years ago, she explained, in case of emergency. The gate swung open, and Ingrid stepped into the corral, making a soft clicking sound with her tongue. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Lillian heard it, the slow, deliberate sound of hooves on gravel. Apollo emerged from the shelter like a ghost. He was the color of weathered stone. What might once have been gray or white now faded to something in between. His ribs showed through his shaggy coat, and his back swayed with age. The cataracts Ingrid had mentioned clouded both eyes, giving him a milky, distant gaze. Scars crisscrossed his shoulders and flanks, old wounds that had healed badly. But despite everything, the age, the infirmity, the visible history of abuse, there was something undeniably noble about the horse. He moved with dignity, his head held high despite the obvious pain in his joints. When he reached Ingrid, he lowered his nose to her outstretched hand, accepting the piece of apple she offered with the gentleness of an old friend. Lillian felt tears stream down her face before she realized she was crying. Not delicate, silent tears, but great, racking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. All the grief she'd held back since Henry's death, all the confusion and hurt and betrayal and love, it poured out of her as she watched this ancient horse accept his treat. Ingrid looked over, her own eyes wet. "It's okay. Henry cried the first time he brought me here too." Lillian wiped her face with her sleeve and forced herself to breathe. After a moment, she stepped into the corral, moving slowly so as not to startle Apollo. The horse turned his clouded eyes in her direction, his ears swiveling forward with interest. "Can he see me?" "Barely. Mostly he relies on sound and smell now." Lillian extended her hand, letting Apollo investigate her scent. His breath was warm against her palm, his whiskers soft. Up close she could see more scars, a deep one along his neck, another that had torn his ear, dozens of smaller marks that spoke of a lifetime of cruelty. "What kind of illegal activities?" she asked quietly, still focused on the horse. Ingrid began spreading fresh feed in the trough. "Racing, I think. The underground kind, where they doped the horses and bet heavily. Henry's father apparently ran a small operation back in the 70s and 80s. Apollo was one of his best horses until the cataracts started forming. After that, he was just another mouth to feed. And Raymond, from what Henry told me, Raymond was the gentle one. Loved horses but hated what his father did to them. He and Henry had very different ways of dealing with their father's abuse. Henry learned to keep his head down, to survive by not making waves. Raymond confronted it head-on. Lillian stroked Apollo's neck, feeling the warmth of him, the slow and steady beat of his heart. "What happened to Raymond?" Ingrid was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Henry never told me the full story. Just that there was a fight in 1987, something about Raymond trying to take Apollo and leave. The father went into a rage. Henry tried to intervene, but..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Raymond ended up dead, and the official story was that it was an accident, a fall during ranch work. The father was never charged with anything. And Henry blamed himself, said he should have been braver, should have protected Raymond the way Raymond tried to protect the horses. So when he found Apollo nearly dead a few years later, the father had essentially abandoned the horse to starve after Raymond died. Henry saw it as a chance for redemption. He built this place, brought Apollo here, and has been caring for him ever since. A secret penance for a secret guilt." Apollo finished the apple and began investigating Lillian's pockets, looking for more treats. Despite everything, or perhaps because of it, she found herself smiling. "Why didn't he tell me?" The question came out smaller than she'd intended. Shame, maybe, or protection. "Henry loved you, Mrs. Foster. Every time I saw him, he talked about you, how strong you were, how lucky he felt to have found someone who understood ranch life. I think he wanted to protect you from the darker parts of his past, and honestly, I think he was afraid." "Of what?" "That if you knew what kind of family he came from, what he'd failed to do, you might not love him the same way. Might see him as weak or complicit." Lillian thought about that, about the Henry she'd known, and the Henry she was discovering. The man who'd worked himself to exhaustion every day, who'd been unfailingly kind to animals and patient with her, who'd built a life of integrity and honesty on a foundation of secrets. She wanted to be angry at him for the deception, but all she felt was a profound sadness. "How long does he have?" she asked, nodding at Apollo. Ingrid examined the horse with a practiced eye, running her hands along his spine, checking his teeth and hooves. "Days, maybe weeks. His organs are failing. He's in pain, though he hides it well. The most humane thing would be..." "No." Lillian's voice was firm. "Henry kept him alive for 40 years. I'm not ending it now. Even if it means he suffers." Lillian looked at Apollo, really looked at him, saw past the scars and the cataracts and the swayed back to the animal underneath. An animal that had survived unspeakable cruelty, that had outlived his abuser, that had become the focal point of one man's desperate attempt at redemption. "I'll know when it's time," she said quietly, but not yet. Over the following weeks, Lillian established a new routine. Every morning she'd load the ATV with supplies and make the journey to the hidden corral. Ingrid had shown her how to check Apollo's vital signs, what to look for in terms of distress or decline. The horse seemed to accept her presence with equanimity, as if he'd been expecting her all along. She talked to him while she worked, cleaning the shelter, spreading fresh hay, filling the water trough. She told him about Henry, about the life they'd built together, about all the small moments and quiet days that had made up their marriage. It felt good to talk, to fill the silence of the forest with words. And slowly, as she spent time in that clearing, Lillian began to understand what Henry had been doing all these years. This wasn't just about keeping a promise to a dead brother. This was about creating a space where the past couldn't reach, where the damage done could be, if not undone, at least contained. Every bag of feed, every visit, every gentle word had been Henry's way of saying, "I see what happened, I acknowledge the harm, and I refuse to let it be the end of the story." One afternoon, while brushing Apollo's matted coat, Lillian found something strange, a small lump on the horse's shoulder, hidden beneath the long hair. She probed it gently, and Apollo flinched. Not a lump, something embedded in the skin, hard and round. She called Ingrid immediately. "I found something. Feels like metal, maybe. Under the skin on his left shoulder." Ingrid arrived within 2 hours, her truck loaded with portable X-ray equipment. Together, they sedated Apollo enough to examine him properly. The X-ray revealed what Lillian had suspected: a bullet. Old, encased in scar tissue, probably there for decades. "From the racing days?" Lillian asked. Ingrid shook her head slowly, studying the image. "Wrong caliber. This is from a handgun, not a rifle. And look at the angle. It entered from above, like someone shot down at him." The implication hung in the air between them. Lillian felt her stomach turn. His father? Probably. Maybe as punishment, maybe he was trying to put the horse down and didn't finish the job. Either way, Apollo survived it. They left the bullet where it was, too dangerous to remove now, and it wasn't causing active harm. But the discovery changed something in Lillian. That night, she went back to Henry's office and renewed her search with fresh determination. She found Raymond's death certificate in a locked drawer she'd previously overlooked. The key from the Corral shelter fit perfectly. Inside the drawer was a manila envelope containing documents Henry had clearly never wanted anyone to see. Raymond Foster, age 29, died August 15, 1987. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head, ruled accidental. Witness statement from Harold Foster, the father, claimed Raymond had been kicked by a spooked horse while working alone in the barn. But there were other papers too. Medical records showing Raymond had been treated for broken ribs 3 months before his death. A police report from a domestic disturbance call to the ranch in 1986, dismissed because no one pressed charges. And a handwritten letter never sent in Henry's shaky adolescent script. "I saw what really happened. I saw Dad hit Raymond with the fence post. I saw Raymond fall and not get up. I saw Dad drag Apollo into the barn and shoot him, then leave him to bleed. I was too scared to tell anyone. I'm a coward. I'm sorry, Ray. I'm so sorry." The letter was dated August 16, 1987, the day after Raymond's death. Henry would have been 26 years old. Lillian sat with the letter for a long time, reading it over and over. She thought about Henry as a young man, traumatized and terrified, watching his father murder his brother and then spending the next 4 decades trying to make amends. The corral wasn't just for Apollo. It was for Raymond too. A secret memorial, a hidden sanctuary, a place where Henry could tend to the wound that had never healed. She thought about all the times Henry had driven out to that clearing, hundreds, maybe thousands of trips over the years, every visit a confession, a prayer, an apology, and she'd never known, never suspected. For the first time, Lillian felt angry, not at Henry's secret, but at his loneliness. He'd carried this burden alone for so long, had built walls around his pain so high that even she, his wife, his partner, couldn't see over them. They could have carried it together. She would have understood, but maybe that was the point. Maybe Henry hadn't wanted understanding. Maybe he'd wanted to keep this one thing pure, untainted by anyone else's opinion or judgment. Maybe Apollo, alone in that clearing, was the only creature in the world who could receive Henry's penance without complication. The next morning, Lillian brought the letter with her to the corral. She read it aloud to Apollo while he ate his breakfast, his ears flicking back and forth as if listening. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her jacket. "He loved you," she told the horse, "not just because of Raymond, but because you survived. You're proof that something good can come from something terrible. That damage doesn't have to be permanent." Apollo lifted his head from the feed trough and regarded her with those clouded eyes. For just a moment, Lillian could have sworn she saw recognition there, not of her specifically, but of the pattern. Another human, another voice, another person trying to make sense of old wounds. "I'm going to take care of you," she promised, "for as long as you need." It was a promise she'd keep. Not because Henry had asked her to, he hadn't, had specifically tried to spare her this burden, but because she chose to. Because some promises transcend the people who make them. They become part of the landscape, woven into the land itself. And because she was beginning to realize caring for Apollo was teaching her something about forgiveness. Not forgiving Henry's father. That man didn't deserve forgiveness. But forgiving Henry for his secrets, for his silence, for being human and flawed and afraid. And maybe eventually forgiving herself for all the questions she'd never thought to ask. Winter arrived in earnest in late October, bringing snowstorms that made the journey to the corral increasingly treacherous. Lillian bought a snowmobile to replace the ATV, learned to navigate the trails in whiteout conditions, and reinforced the shelter with additional insulation and heat lamps powered by a small generator. Ingrid warned her it was too much, that she was pushing herself too hard for a horse that was living on borrowed time anyway. But Lillian couldn't stop. Every visit felt urgent, as if Apollo might not be there the next time she arrived. And she needed him to be there. Needed the routine, the purpose, the tangible connection to Henry and his hidden history. In early November, she arrived at the corral to find Apollo lying down in the shelter, unusual for him, as he typically stood to greet her. Her heart seized. She rushed to his side, dropping to her knees in the straw. "Hey, old man. Hey, it's okay, I'm here." Apollo's breathing was labored, his sides heaving with effort. His eyes were unfocused, looking past her at something she couldn't see. She pulled out her phone to call Ingrid, but there was no signal. There never was out here. Lillian ran back to the snowmobile and grabbed the two-way radio she'd started carrying. Ingrid's voice crackled through, thick with static. "I'm on my way. Keep him warm. Don't let him panic." The next hour was the longest of Lillian's life. She lay beside Apollo in the straw, talking to him continuously, telling him every story she could remember about Henry. About their first date, when Henry had been so nervous he'd driven them to the wrong restaurant. About the time he'd tried to surprise her with breakfast in bed and set off the smoke alarm. About the 1,000 small kindnesses that had made up their life together. "He loved you so much," she whispered, her hand on Apollo's neck, feeling the flutter of his pulse. "He would have wanted you to know that. You saved him, in a way, gave him a purpose when he thought he didn't deserve one. You beautiful, stubborn, impossible horse." Apollo's breathing began to steady, and his eye, the one closest to Lillian, focused on her face. In that moment, she felt a connection so profound it took her breath away. This animal had known Henry in ways she never could, had witnessed his grief, his guilt, his unwavering commitment, had been the recipient of a love so fierce and protective it had lasted 4 decades. Ingrid arrived as the sun began to set, her truck barely making it through the snow. She examined Apollo quickly, efficiently, and then sat back on her heels. "His heart's failing. Could be today, could be a week, but we're near the end. Can we make him comfortable? Yes, but Lillian, you need to think about what comes next. He's suffering. Not terribly, but enough. We could... I know. Lillian's voice was steady. But not yet. Please, not yet. They stayed with Apollo through the night, taking turns keeping the generator running, adjusting his position to ease his breathing, monitoring his vital signs. Lillian told Ingrid more of what she'd learned. About Raymond, about the letter, about the bullet still lodged in Apollo's shoulder. Henry and Raymond never got to say goodbye, Lillian said quietly, watching the horse's chest rise and fall. Henry never got closure, but maybe I can give that to him now, to both of them. As dawn broke, Apollo stirred. With enormous effort, he lifted his head and attempted to stand. Lillian and Ingrid helped him, supporting his weight as his legs trembled beneath him. He stood for maybe 30 seconds, looking out at the forest with his clouded eyes, and then lowered himself back down, gently this time, with control. "He's ready," Ingrid said softly. Lillian knew she was right, could feel it in the way Apollo had positioned himself, in the calmness that had settled over him. He'd stood one last time, said his own goodbye to this place, and now he was waiting. "Can we do it here?" Lillian asked. "In the clearing? I don't want his last sight to be a clinic." Ingrid nodded and went to her truck for supplies. While she was gone, Lillian sat with Apollo, stroking his face, memorizing every detail, the scars, the soft muzzle, the ears that still swiveled toward her voice despite everything. "Thank you," she whispered, "for surviving, for giving Henry a reason to be better than his past, for teaching me about promises and forgiveness and the way love can be complicated and hard and still worth it." Ingrid returned with a syringe. "It'll be peaceful. He'll just fall asleep." Lillian held Apollo's head in her lap as Ingrid administered the injection. The horse's breathing slowed, deepened, and then, very gently, stopped. His body relaxed completely, all the pain and age and weariness finally releasing their grip. In the silence that followed, Lillian heard a sound she'd never noticed before, the wind in the pines carrying a melody that sounded almost like relief. They buried Apollo near the Corral, in a spot where wildflowers would grow in the spring. It took them hours to dig through the frozen ground, but Lillian insisted on doing most of the work herself. This was her promise now, her vigil. When they finished, Ingrid stood back, surveying the grave and the clearing beyond. "What will you do with this place?" Lillian looked at the corral, the shelter, the trees standing sentinel around them. "Keep it, maintain it, maybe bring other horses here someday. Rescues, animals that need a safe place. Henry built this as a sanctuary. It should stay that way. He'd like that." "Yeah," Lillian agreed, wiping dirt from her hands. "Yeah, I think he would." As they prepared to leave, Lillian took one last look at the clearing. In the fading light, she could almost see them, Henry and Raymond, brothers separated by death and time, reunited here in this hidden place. And Apollo, young and whole and running free, finally released from the chains of his past. It was a beautiful thought. She chose to believe it was true. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the clearing into something magical. Wildflowers, lupine and Indian paintbrush and columbine covered Apollo's grave in a riot of purple and red and blue. Lillian had planted them herself, working the seeds into the soil during the last snowmelt, and they'd responded with enthusiasm. She visited the corral twice a week now, no longer driven by urgent necessity, but by choice. She'd had the combination lock removed and replaced with a simple gate latch. No more secrets, no more hiding. She'd also erected a small plaque near the shelter. "Apollo, beloved companion, Raymond Foster, 1958, 1987. You were never alone." The ranch itself had begun to change too. Lillian had contacted an equine rescue organization Ingrid recommended, and they'd worked out an arrangement. The Double H would serve as a placement ranch for horses that needed long-term sanctuary. Not many, just 3 or 4 at a time, but enough to give the place purpose again. The first rescue arrived in May. A 25-year-old mare named Stella, blind in one eye from abuse, too old to be adopted, but too healthy to euthanize. Lillian brought her to the clearing, introduced her to the corral and the shelter, and the grave covered in flowers. "Someone very special lived here," she told Stella, running her hand along the mare's neck. "He taught me that surviving isn't the same as healing, but sometimes it's enough, sometimes it's everything." Stella settled in immediately, as if she'd been waiting her whole life for a place exactly like this. Lillian had also made peace with Henry's silence. She'd found a therapist in town, a woman who specialized in grief and family trauma, and had spent months unpacking the complicated feelings around her husband's secret. The anger, the hurt, the love that remained despite everything. "He was protecting you," the therapist had said during one session, "but he was also protecting himself. Some wounds are so deep we can't bear to expose them to light, even to the people who love us. Especially to them, because we're afraid the wound will make us unlovable." Lillian thought about that often as she worked around the ranch. She'd discovered other small secrets in the months since Apollo's death, nothing as significant, but revealing nonetheless. A journal where Henry had written terrible poetry. A box of letters from a woman he'd dated before Lillian, never sent. A collection of carved wooden horses, dozens of them, each one unique. None of it changed how she felt about him. If anything, the secrets made him more real, more human. Not the stoic rancher she'd thought she'd married, but a complicated man carrying complicated pain, doing his best to build something good from something broken. In June, Ingrid stopped by the ranch for a routine check on Stella. They sat on the porch, drinking iced tea and watching the horses graze in the main pasture. "How are you doing?" Ingrid asked. "Really?" Lillian considered the question. 6 months ago, she would have said she was fine, that she was managing, that she didn't need help. But Apollo and the clearing and all those hours alone with her thoughts had taught her the value of honesty. "I'm sad," she said. "I miss Henry. I wish he'd trusted me with his past. But I'm also grateful. Is that strange? I'm grateful I got to know Apollo, got to understand that part of Henry's life. It's like I've been given a gift, even though it came wrapped in grief." Ingrid smiled. "That's not strange at all. Henry loved you enough to keep his darkness away from you, and you loved him enough to carry it after he was gone. That's what real love looks like, I think. Messy and complicated and imperfect." After Ingrid left, Lillian walked out to the main pasture and stood among the horses. 3 rescues now, all living out their days in peace. She thought about expanding the program, maybe building more shelters in different parts of the ranch. The Double H had always been about cattle, but maybe it could be about redemption too. Her phone buzzed, a text from the lawyer handling Henry's estate. There were papers to sign, decisions to make about the ranch's future, practical concerns that couldn't be ignored. But first, she'd make one more trip to the clearing. She'd promised Stella she'd bring fresh hay for the shelter, and promises, she'd learned, were sacred things. Even the hard ones, especially the hard ones. As she loaded the ATV, Lillian caught her reflection in the barn window. She looked older, thinner, tired, but also stronger somehow, more certain. Henry's death had broken something open in her, and Apollo had shown her how to survive the breaking. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the life she had, and she was learning, slowly, painfully, hopefully, how to live it with grace. 1 year after Apollo's death, Lillian stood in the clearing with a small group of people. Ingrid was there, of course, along with the director of the equine rescue organization, 2 volunteers, and a journalist from a regional magazine who'd heard about the sanctuary and wanted to write a story. Lillian had been hesitant about the publicity, but Ingrid had convinced her. "What Henry did for Apollo, what you're doing now, it matters. Other people need to know it's possible to make amends, to build something beautiful from something broken." So she'd agreed, on the condition that Raymond's name be included in any article. This was his story too, his legacy as much as Henry's. The journalist, a young woman named Charlotte, was recording their conversation. So when you discovered the corral, you had no idea your husband had been caring for this horse for 40 years? None, Lillian confirmed. But looking back, there were signs. Times when he'd disappear for hours, days when he'd come home exhausted for no apparent reason. I just thought it was ranch work, and it was, in a way, just not the kind I understood. And now you're carrying on his mission, expanding it, Lillian corrected. The Double H Sanctuary currently houses 7 rescue horses, with plans to accommodate 10 by next year. We focus on senior animals and those with special needs, the ones most rescues can't place. We give them a dignified end of life. Charlotte looked around the clearing, her eyes landing on Apollo's grave, still brilliant with flowers. It's beautiful here, peaceful. It is now, Lillian said quietly. But it was born from violence, from abuse and loss and terrible choices. I think it's important to remember that, not to glorify suffering, but to acknowledge that healing is possible. Change is possible. The group dispersed to explore the clearing, leaving Lillian alone for a moment. She knelt by Apollo's grave, touching the plaque she'd installed. "We did it, old man," she whispered. "Turned your suffering into something good. I hope wherever you are, wherever Henry and Raymond are, you can see it." A breeze moved through the pines, carrying the scent of wildflowers and earth. Lillian closed her eyes and let herself remember. Henry's laugh, Apollo's soft nose against her palm, the weight of secrets and the lightness of truth. When she opened her eyes, Ingrid was standing nearby, watching her with understanding. "You okay?" "Yeah," Lillian said, standing and brushing dirt from her knees. "Yeah, I really am." They walked back to where the others were gathered. Charlotte had more questions about funding, about future plans, about the emotional toll of running a sanctuary. Lillian answered each one honestly, no longer afraid of revealing the complicated truth beneath the surface. Later, as everyone prepared to leave, Charlotte pulled Lillian aside. "I have to ask, do you ever feel angry? At your husband for keeping this secret? At his father for causing such damage? At Raymond for dying and leaving Henry with that burden?" Lillian thought about it, really thought. Sometimes. Grief isn't linear, and neither is forgiveness. Some days I'm furious that Henry didn't trust me with this. Other days I understand completely why he kept it private. And his father, I'm working on not letting that anger poison me. He's dead. He can't hurt anyone anymore. The best revenge is this, turning his legacy of cruelty into a legacy of compassion. And Raymond? Raymond was a victim who became a hero. He stood up to a monster, tried to protect an innocent creature, and paid the ultimate price. I'm not angry at him. I'm honored to finally know his story. As Charlotte drove away, promising to send the article for approval before publication, Lillian remained in the clearing with Ingrid and the rescue director. They discussed practical matters, fence repairs, winter preparations, a fundraiser to expand the program. But Lillian's mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about promises and how they ripple through time. Henry's promise to Raymond had lasted 40 years. Her promise to Henry would last the rest of her life, and the promise she was making to every horse that came to the Double H, that they would be safe, valued, allowed to live and die with dignity. That promise would outlast them all. The sun was setting, painting the clearing in shades of gold and amber. Stella and the other horses grazed peacefully, their presence a living testament to the power of redemption. Lillian took one last look at Apollo's grave before heading back to the ranch. Tomorrow she'd return, and the day after and the day after that. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because this place, born from secrets and sustained by love, had become holy ground. And some ground, she'd learned, was worth tending forever. 3 years have passed since Lillian discovered the hidden corral. The Double H Sanctuary now houses 12 rescue horses and has a waiting list of animals needing placement. Lillian has hired 2 full-time staff members and trains volunteers through a partnership with the local community college. The magazine article Charlotte wrote went viral, leading to donations from across the country. With that funding, Lillian established the Raymond and Henry Foster Memorial Fund, which provides grants to small equine rescues doing similar work. She never remarried. Some evenings, she still sits in Henry's office, surrounded by his papers and maps, and feels his presence, not haunting, just there. A reminder that love doesn't end with death. It transforms. The clearing itself has become a kind of pilgrimage site. People who've read the story sometimes ask to visit Apollo's grave, to see the place where 40 years of devotion played out in secret. Lillian allows it, understanding that some stories need to be witnessed to maintain their power. Last month, she received a letter from a man claiming to be Raymond's childhood friend. He'd seen the article and wanted to share his memories of Raymond's kindness, his love of horses, his quiet courage. The letter ended with a simple thank you for making sure he wasn't forgotten. Lillian keeps that letter in the drawer where she found the map, alongside Henry's unsent confession and photographs of Apollo. The drawer isn't locked anymore. There are no more secrets to protect, no more shame to hide. Just a story of two brothers, a horse that wouldn't die, and a woman who learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is carrying someone else's burden. Not because you have to, but because you choose to. The clearing still stands, wild and beautiful, flowers blooming over the grave of an old horse who survived everything. And every morning, Lillian makes the journey there, keeping promises that have become prayers, tending ground that has become sacred. Some wounds never fully heal, but in the right soil, with enough care and time, they can bloom.